that. Let's talk to James Heale, Deputy Political Editor, of course, at The Spectator. James, very good morning to you.
Morning, Mike.
I don't know what Pat McFadden's on about. Do you? Why are they doing this test on September the 7th, this, emergency test, which in the midst of all of the nonsense that the government's dealing with, they're bothering with? What are they doing?
Well, I mean, they do this every so often, of course. They did one, I remember, a couple of years ago, and I came and bleeping on my phone.
Yeah.
But, I mean, what was so striking from the interview was the inability to explain why. Now, I think there is a case to say we need an alert system. It's just we're not hearing it. And I find that so patronising from the government when they won't actually tell you why they're doing what they're doing.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing. I mean, obviously, I'm being slightly tongue-in-cheek, but, they've got so many issues to deal with. I mean, we're watching this morning that just looking at a handful of news stories, including the migrant crisis, which continues, this conversation that they're going to have with Emmanuel Macron over the next couple of days where, as well as I do, nothing much is going to come out of it. There'll be a lot of shaking of hands, and they're going to go and parade around some kind of military base, and it's all going to look terribly nice and friendly. But, the one-in, one-out policy is a complete and utter nonsense. It's never going to work. It's a completely pointless activity, which the EU will probably kibosh anyway. Nobody's going to ask Emmanuel Macron to account for the 771 million quid we've already given him, for which we've received the square root of absolutely nothing, nil point on that one. We've got, courts that can't cater for all the criminals that need to go through it. We've got prisons where people are going in and just getting high and watching television. There's nothing good in the world that the Labour government has got going on. And here they are telling us we're going to have some kind of alert on September the 7th, and nobody knows why.
Well, I think that maybe it's to show that one bit the state still does work. They can still send a message to all our phones and irritate us for 10 seconds on September the 7th. Look, I mean, in terms of the visit by Macron, I mean, this is going to be the Tory attack line, which is that, they looked at this 2.5 years ago. I think Kit Malthouse, who's a Conservative MP, has been proposing this for about 2-3 years now. And, of course, the downside of this is that it could potentially merely reward people who come here illegally and encourage more people to sort of actually come to the north of France and wait and apply for asylum here. And the question is, of course, in terms of, so that allows people in who are some of the one in. And in terms of the one out, I mean, we have to be very wary about this kind of talk about deportations to France, etc., given, of course, we know how few we've deported against their will, certainly, over the past 18 months.
Right. Well, we haven't really deported any. I mean, the government still occasionally says we've deported 30,000 people, which is a figure that was produced back in November, 24,000 of whom voluntarily went, and many of them probably were actually paid to go. So we haven't really deported more than about probably, 5,000, maybe 6,000 people. And even they probably weren't particularly difficult to deport. But we've done nothing since then, and that's more than, 6 months ago.
Yeah, certainly. And, of course, if we are unable to return people to France, either against their will or, as I say, deported, the danger is, of course, then, Mike, is that people keep coming here. So what you end up with is a one-in, two-in system, basically, which is that, people keep crossing the channel, and, of course, we keep allowing them to stay here legally. So I think that there's lots of question marks about this scheme. It's going to be announced with much fanfare, with the usual sort of great pageantry, officers of state, etc. Look, we've got to remember this is all about Labour and the Home Office trying to find something acceptable, which is why I think we saw those images of the boat being slashed last week. Right. And, of course, then the French came out and said they wouldn't do this for all the boats. It's all about preparing the groundwork so they can say 1 year on, with record levels running at 20,000 already, but they are doing something in office.
Right. I mean, what's the kind of the history of the state visit scenario? Because, I mean, it kind of comes at a time when, it doesn't really need to be a state visit. Macron is not exactly riding high in the polls himself. He's not really particularly a key figure any longer. I mean, I see that at some point or other, the words "the coalition of the willing" is going to come up again, and you think, well, whatever happened to that? Whatever happened to us being on a war footing? Whatever happened to Keir Starmer saying just last month, we're constantly under attack from Russia, and we should be ready for, anything as far as, militarily and cyber-wise and everything else. I mean, it's almost as though, things come in, they go out. He makes a statement one week, he forgets about it the next week. Why on earth a state visit, and why now?
Well, we used to have a state visit. There was an Anglo-French summit typically every year or two, up until the Brexit years, when we sort of suspended that as a sign of increasing tension between the two countries. And one can understand that there is a need for Anglo-French cooperation on a range of different areas about smuggling, about security, etc. But I do think that on the question of migration, the fundamental issue is the French will never care as much about people leaving their waters as the English will about people arriving here. And that's understandable. We just have less of an incentive to do so. So in terms of, what the government's saying about this state visit, they're emphasising that, migration is just one aspect of it. It's just one of a range of different measures. But the stuff that is going to be uncontroversial, frankly, everyone will shrug their shoulders at. And I'm sure there'll be some important work, but stuff that most people would find unobjectionable about, say, for instance, intelligence sharing. But on the question of one in, one out, I think that this potentially, because even though this is the sort of equivalent, if you will, of Keir Starmer's Rwanda deal, this is what he's saying. We need, instead of a deterrent, this is our own deterrent, effectively. If it fails to live up to expectation, I think people will be asking questions about why they spent so much time invested in it.
Right. But I mean, there's no question now that immigration is the single biggest issue that faces Britain at the moment. Everybody talks about it. The populace wants something done about it. Even voters who 2 years ago would have said, oh, we don't really mind, it's just something that goes on around us. Everybody wants the government to be seen to be doing something about it, but yet they still seem incapable of doing anything about it. We saw a story just yesterday saying we've set aside £60 million for legal aid so that people who have been told that they haven't been successful in their asylum-seeking claim can fight it, and they can appeal, and we can pay them for it, and we can pay lawyers to do it for them. More and more people are coming over the borders. They just seem incapable of doing anything about it, and it's holding them below the waterline, it seems to me.
Well, I think that you touched on it earlier when you said about every week the government seems to be sort of veering from issue to issue. And sometimes we're saying, for instance, China, we want your money, you're very welcome here. The next week we're saying, actually, they're one of our most significant threats. And that kind of lack of a holistic approach is certainly evident when it comes, I think, to immigration, where parts of the system are still acting as though this was sort of, the 90s or the early noughties and very much welcoming of these people. Others, of course, are saying a much tougher line. And so I do think that lack of a proper plan before coming to office is now being exposed somewhat. And we are seeing, unfortunately, just a continuation in the last couple of years under Rishi Sunak without the silver bullet, if that's what the Tories would call it, without that element of the Rwanda. So I think that, in terms of legal arrival, certainly, I think it's an area where Labour perhaps were more underprepared than others.
Yeah, exactly right. An interesting piece in The Guardian today about John Caldwell, who's the Phones for You founder, former Tory donor, I believe, who's now a Labour donor. He kind of switched over just before the election. He says he's very worried and increasingly nervous about the government's direction and is in despair of politicians. I mean, he's quite a character, this guy, isn't he? I mean, he's quite outspoken. He appears on various different media. We've had him on this show quite a few times as well. But he's clearly worried about this wealth tax sort of scenario which is looming and which Labour refused to deny they're thinking about. What's going on with that?
Well, I think that this comes after a year in which Labour, of course, have had to raise taxes more than most of them privately were hoping or expected to. That's partly because of the worsened fiscal situation, but also because it's a revealed preference of their backbenchers. They constantly want to find more money for more spending. They've been unable to counter spending cuts. The obvious thing then is increased taxes. And so it's no surprise that some of the people that Labour were making sort of nice words to in the 2 or 3 years up until the election are now getting increasingly worried about it. And I suspect we will see some kind of increased tax on the wealthy, whether it's a sort of formal wealth tax, which obviously would only exacerbate this problem that many of John Caldwell's peers are having, which is they're leaving the country right now. We've already had the flight of the non-doms. Remains to be seen. But I do think that it's a sign increasingly of business falling out of love with this government. And that's on a different range of areas. You've already seen like Morrison's and supermarkets attack the family farms tax. You've already seen the sort of lots of criticism at the CBI about all the stuff that's been going on with the national insurance rise. And I think that this is another sign, John Caldwell's comments, just a year after Labour got elected, is that not all going terribly well, to say the least.
Yeah, absolutely right. And what about the internal workings of Downing Street? After last week, which was a complete and utter, I can't say the word, but disaster, shall we say, kindly. And Rachel Reeves in tears, floods of tears, sobbing her eyes out at Prime Minister's questions, then appearing on Thursday as if everything was fine, dancing about, smiling and laughing and joking, like some kind of, newly formed member of Fleetwood Mac, and you just think, What's going on exactly? Who exactly is wielding the power? Is Keir Starmer a busted flush? You know, will Rachel Reeves last out the year? So many questions. And again, I mean, maybe it's the media's fault as well. Everybody sort of moved on from. Nobody's talking about it.
Well, I think that what we're expecting to see is get to summer, get to recess, a couple of weeks' time. And then I suspect we will, I was talking to one Labour MP about this, you know, Keir Starmer's in one of his brooding moods, and I think then we might see some changes in terms of the Baron person. Now, Keir Starmer, I think probably broadly to his credit, you know, isn't someone who will necessarily sort of humiliate staff in a public way that some of the previous regimes has, and I think there'll be some quiet people moving in and out of Downing Street. But in terms of the cabinet and the reshuffle, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's difficult to think what Rachel Reeves will do to turn it around. Of course, she's promised endlessly she wouldn't have a budget like the scale of last time. Last time she increased taxes by 38 billion. This time, according to Capital Economics, she'll increase it by 20 billion. So I think that maybe she's got another budget, but if it doesn't turn around soon, you're thinking this is a drag. This is a bad economic messenger. This is someone who, when she speaks, lets down the government's polling. So I'm not really sure. The question is, of course, whether Keir Starmer could ditch her while surviving himself. And history shows that chancellors who act and make the prime minister overall quite weaker.
Yes, but I mean, the economy is in a terrible place. In the doldrums is a nice way to describe it. And there are plenty of people, some of them in sort of financial institutions, who tell me that there's a pretty big risk that the economy is teetering on the brink of collapse, and that, you know, any more borrowing and suddenly somebody might pull the rug on it.
Yeah, well, my understanding is that I think a lot of these bond markets and traders look for the weakest link in any financial system. Yeah. If we're considered the second or third weakest link, we should be okay. But if we're not, you're very much, as you say, Mike, potentially going to be exposed. I mean, when it came to the spending review a few weeks ago, I wrote that she was not the Iron Chancellor, but the Iron Chancellor. She is betting that these might not come back and haunt her. But I think that there's a real risk of that. Now, in fairness to the Labour government, over the past couple of weeks or so, gilt yields remain broadly stable up until those tiers last Wednesday, but overall it's a very precarious position, and it gives them far less freedom than they thought they might have. They may be in office, but they're not necessarily in power. Right,
and that is the problem, I think. But you're being far too kind to them, James, and we'll have to have a word with you. We'll have to go and have a drink at some point. Thank you very much indeed. James Heale, Deputy Political Editor at The Spectator.